Section 15 is going to be looking at economic growth. So we start off with these three questions. How important is it? How does our economy actually grow? And then what policies can promote economic growth? When we talk about economic growth, we're referring to increases in the output of goods and services. You guys should remember that from an earlier section, we looked at our production possibilities curve. And you can remember that our production possibilities here is just looking at the possibilities we have as a country or as an economy to produce. And usually we just look at alternative combinations. Here we have a combination as being either making investment goods or making consumption goods. We look at a certain time period and then we assume that we're using all available resources and technology. Now, if we're only looking at the short run, our policy here is to make sure that we move out and that we are producing along our production possibilities curve. Because when we produce at a point on this curve, such as point B here, that means we're maximizing all of our resources. If we're not along this line, if we're in here at A, then this is where we have unemployment. And we do not want this. We do not want unemployment. So we don't want to be at point A. We want to be at point B or some other point along this line. Now if we're looking at the long run, that's actually growing our curve. So in the long run, we draw a new line. So here, notice that now our maximum possibilities of production has increased. So in this one, now both A and B are causing unemployment. And that's because we want to be here at point C. Because here at point C, we're at our maximum capacity to produce. For example, if we were to produce here at B, we'd have B amount of investment goods and B amount of consumption goods. But notice if I were to create another point, say point Y here, at point Y I'd have the same amount of investment goods but even more consumption goods. So obviously point Y would be better, and point Y is on this further out curve. So in the long run, we expand our capacity, and this difference here, the difference between these two lines, this would be our economic growth. And that's what we want. So in the long run, we see economic growth. In the short run, we want to maximize all of our resources to make sure we're using all of them. So to get this economic growth, this increase in output, we want to push our production possibilities outward. Increase that line. Now when we look at the aggregate supply here, this is really going to determine what our economic growth can be. And also it's going to determine on our short run. So it's going to determine how closely we can actually get and how easily we can get to maximizing our output here. It also shows us how much inflation we'll see. Remember, inflation is just an increase in our general level of prices. And the long run here is going to tell us how much our total output is limited by how much growth we can achieve. And so this supply side policy here fits under the policy levers, but we're only going to be focusing on this outcome of growth. You're going to want to keep in mind the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal is just current prices, And then real, we adjust for inflation. So thus it's constant prices. This is a much better comparison as to using nominal GDP. To figure out our growth rate, so we can compare our actual economic growth over a set time period, it's just a percentage change in real GDP from one period to another, so just over time. And this is our equation. So our growth rate is just our change in real GDP over our base period GDP. And so here over this timeline, we've seen over the years, we've had increases in our growth rate, decreases in our growth rate. Here, when our growth rate is negative, and over here now, all of these are called recessions when we have negative growth. And then all of these in the green, and all these above, these are called expansions. And we're expanding GDP. Now we do see somewhat of an exponential process. And that's when we look at the cumulative, the interest or growth becomes compounded. So if we were to look at our actual total GDP, we would see something like this. So it's an exponential growth. It's inclining faster and faster. Now when we look at actual standard of living, or to see how well off we are, we look at GDP per capita. And so we do that by taking real GDP and then we divide by our population. And then that gives us this GDP per capita. So the only time we can increase GDP per capita is when real GDP grows faster than our population. And we've seen that, especially from 1970 to 1990. And here are a whole bunch of different determinants or indicators to show that. See, the average size of a new home has gone up. The new homes with air conditioning, huge difference for people using computers, TVs, the amount of net worth or income people have. Right, how many people are driving 2 cars, heart transplants, people are working less, spending less time working in the home, they're taking more vacations. So all of this, you guys can go down the line here, just all these different types of indicators of our economic growth. Also looking at the number of people finishing high school, increasing, and the number of people finishing 4 years of college. Here you can see some of the growth explosion from 1820 up through 1995. Really here, see we have a little steady growth from year 0 to 1500s, and not even really that much growth from 1500 to 1820. Right, this pretty much only triples. Whereas from 1820 to 1995, if we were just looking at North America here, then it's over 20 times. So from 15, about 3 times, and about 20 times from 1820 to 1995 when we look at this growth. Similarly, the average person today has twice as many goods and services as the average person had a generation ago. So our growth, because it's exponential, the amount that's changing is more and more and more every year. And if you were to look at this, you can see the higher our growth rate, the less and less and less it takes for us to double that amount. If we want to measure our productivity is the amount of output per worker. If we're thinking about labor productivity, so output per unit of input. If we're looking at the labor force or the worker, it'd be how much each worker brings to the table, or how much each worker produces. A labor force are all persons over age 16, and they're working or actively seeking work. The employment rate is just the amount of this labor force that is employed. If we want sustained increases in GDP per capita, it's usually going to come from increases in output per worker. So increases in productivity. We increase productivity, we get these increases in GDP per capita. And if we're to look at this change in total output from based on labor, it's a combination of the increased amount of labor hours or hours worked plus our productivity. And that would give us our total change in this output. For some other sources of productivity growth, we can have higher skills, so such as an increase in labor skills, more capital, so the increase in ratio of the tools that each of those workers has, improved management, so the entrepreneurial ability is better. We know how to better use those resources within the production process so they produce more, and also technological advance, so the quality of that capital equipment is increasing. In 1950, less than 8% of all U.S. workers had completed college. Now, over 30% have completed 4 years of college. You go to school so that you can get your degree, and then once you come out of it, you have your diploma and you say, look, I'm this much smarter now. My quality as a labor resource has increased. We've also had a lot of capital investment. Now, investment is when businesses spend money on new plant and equipment, or if they have increases in their business inventories. And it's the idea that they're buying more tools to use for all of their other resources. For management, this is looking at the entrepreneurial ability. So they decide how those resources are being organized. The better they organize whichever labor with the capital, the more productive they're going to be. And also especially deals with incentives when you're looking at the labor force, because you want employees to contribute to production and have the desire to work. Research and development is what gives us our changes in technology. Remember that advances in technology and capital investment typically go hand in hand. So if we have these advances in technology, these new businesses are going to buy that new technology. They're going to buy whatever capital is using and harnessing that new technology. And that leads us to the economic growth, which makes us better off. Now, government has a few policy levers they can use to try and stimulate economic growth. First being education and training. And this is the idea that first it'll stimulate the economy in the short run by using up any unused resources. And it would also increase it in the long run because this improves labor quality. So if we're increasing the quality of those resources, that gives us that long run growth. For immigration policy, so when we have this influx of immigrants, it's increasing the labor force. So you get this increase in the number of labor hours. You can think of education and training as increasing productivity, output per worker. They also have investment incentives. So if the government were to decrease tax policy, then that could give people the incentive to invest more. So lowering this tax rate on the capital gains can stimulate more capital investment. So hopefully it's with the idea that you're going to get more productive uses out of that change in investment. They can also affect consumption and savings for the individuals within the society. We get to saving by income minus consumption. Or saving is just money that's not spent. So if people save, then they're going to be putting it into a bank somewhere. We learned in the earlier section, you put money into a bank, then the bank gets to create more money for somebody else, whether it be a business that's going to invest it, or somebody else that's going to spend it. Here we can see in 2006, the United States was actually dis-saving. Dis-saving occurs when our consumption is greater than our disposable income. That means overall we were borrowing money. Borrowing to the point that America is in debt. Now, when the government uses these policy levers, they can cause crowding out. So if they increase the amount that the government is borrowing, you're reducing the amount of the private sector borrowing. Same with if you look at spending. If the government stops its borrowing, then they'll increase private sector borrowing. So you can also get the opposite effect. It's important to remember that we need to look at how is the government affecting the short run and the long run, both aggregate demand and also aggregate supply. A lot of the times when we look at deregulation, it's the idea that if the government does regulate, it's increasing production costs. So if you decrease regulation, then you shift aggregate supply to the right. If you shift production costs down, you increase aggregate supply. Within our factor markets, we have a minimum wage law to state that everyone gets a decent standard of living. But if employers can't hire low-paid workers lower than the minimum wage, they're limiting the ability of them to hire additional workers that are under the minimum wage. So instead of hiring them below the wage, they just don't hire them at all. So these regulations can raise the cost of production and also inhibit supply responses, such as hiring more workers. There can also be regulation within transportation markets. So if they were to ease some of that regulations, we can get more output, lower prices, and innovation within those travel markets. So whether it be telecommunications or land transportation, for examples. Another example would be food and drug standards. So the FDA entails real costs. The more you increase cost, the smaller your supply. And we've seen fewer new drugs being brought out to market. And when they are finally making it to market, they are more expensive than they would be in absence of regulation, with the idea that they're just bearing the additional cost from the FDA. All of this, we need to keep in mind that the more economic freedom we have, the higher the GDP per capita, and the faster our economic growth. So whenever you're thinking about what government policy is putting in place, we have to see how is that going to affect our economy. And that is the end of section 15.